And my recorder is on. I'm going to place it here. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Opal.
Wa alaikum assalam, Sister Zainab.
I'm very happy to be here to talk to you at Atlanta Masjid.
Alhamdulillah. So I'm happy to also have a chance to be interviewed with you and by you.
Thank you. So just for the record, I would like you to state your name, and you are?
My name is Opal J. Muhammad. And what else did you need to know?
Your date of birth and your place of birth.
My date of birth is June 10th, 1945. And I am a native of the United States, of course, but I was born in Arkansas. Migrated here from California.
Excellent. What is your current occupation?
Currently, I am a retired educator and resuming that same occupation as a private business owner with my company called Jewel Institute. I'm also a retired airline agent.
Okay, awesome. And for the record, I will state that our interview is taking place on February 9, 2014 at the Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam. And what we're doing today is a Tell Your Story Day. And essentially, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your family and the cities you've lived in and the historical moments you've experienced, how you came to Islam. But it really, it's much more of a conversation, a dialogue, than a kind of a formal interview. And for the record, the people conducting the interview are Zainab Ansari and Sausan Muhammad. And Sister Opal, I'm going to just begin really by asking you to tell me about your family background, where you were born, places that you've lived in, a little bit about your childhood.
Oh, okay. I recently shared that story, a similar story, with one of my granddaughters, and I was amazed that they were so amazed that we had such a history in my family. The two maiden sides of my family are the Stories and the Walker, and we were all settled in Arkansas. My hometown was Texarkana, which was the twin city of Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas. So we had a close affiliation with both the Texas people and the Arkansas people, with laws on different sides of the states, on different sides of the city that were different. So there were certain laws that were passed for the Texas side and some for the Arkansas side. So as a child, whenever we crossed the state line, we knew that we were subject to certain kinds of laws, especially some civil rights laws occasionally. Some of them had to do with using the libraries or not being able to use the library at that time. And of course, this was for me, during that time, I would say in the early 60s, beginning of late 50s. Around that time is when I had knowledge of this. My family, on my father's side, were farmers, and they did some sharecropping. They did what we now call community gardens, where several families would get together on one big piece of land, which later, as a matter of fact, became my first elementary school, the land that they were working on. My mother's side also had farming background, and my mother rode horses when she was a child, and they lived in a small town down in Arkansas called Magnolia, Arkansas, and that was the Story family. And they became huge landowners, and some of that land is still passed on through the generations. I remember Imam Pleman talking about something like that recently, about passing on this land. And some of that land, of course, not of course, but some of that land had oil on it. And it's interesting how over the years, my family, who wasn't aware of the different benefits of keeping the land or giving it up or selling rights to it, eventually, made decisions to allow some of those rights to be bought. So now some of that land, which has oil on it, is owned by huge corporations. A large part of it, and a very small part of it is still owned by my family. And that's another story that I want to write about one day. My mother and father together moved to Texarkana when my oldest sister was a young girl, and she's 10 years older than I am, my elder. And they came to Texarkana, and one of the things that was remarked at my oldest sister's funeral was that that was the family that had oil, and they also had a piano. So that was the family known as oil owners and piano owners. As a result, having a piano in our family all of our lives, all of us were exposed to music, all 6 of us. And some of us went on to pursue music as a career, and particularly 2 of my family members. I always had an interest and love in it for it as well. My family were really strong supporters of education. My father had taught actually my oldest sister when she was a very young girl. And he had 2 years of college education, and at that time that was enough to be a school teacher. He later, because of the children, had to move on to other occupations, and he ended up working with the railroads and then some other occupations after that. My mother, on the other hand, had not graduated from high school at the time that she had all of these children, but she had been fortunate enough to travel to another state to live with an uncle who was a well-known bishop and had money and was able to afford for her to come to live in a city. Actually, it was in Topeka, Kansas, where she got a chance to go as far as the 11th grade. Later on, she pursued her finishing high school. But most people thought my mother was college educated. She eventually became a well-known person in my home city as a speaker. She was sang and she played piano, and she instilled in us the desire for education. And you know, I have 5 other brothers and sisters that I haven't mentioned, 4 others that I haven't mentioned that much, but some of them chose different professions, and one, of course, went on to become a major musician. And he became a jazz artist as well as a high school band teacher. He was my first band teacher, as a matter of fact. And later on, he passed away after deciding that it was time to retire. And he actually went into the ministry for a brief time, a Christian ministry. I'm the only and first of my family to become Muslim. And in my initial, among my siblings, of course, my parents were Christians. And we were always in the church. And my father was the superintendent of the Sunday school. And my mother, as I told you, she played, and she also was a teacher in the Sunday school. So we were taught Christianity with the little cards, and we always saw the images that were always there, and I was, as a child, always questioning, but I couldn't understand how the scriptures related to what I was seeing happening in the church in terms of images and so forth, and praying to images, and that was always a big problem for me as a child. And I never knew that eventually it would find itself in my life as a way of answering some of those questions through Islam. But my father and mother were well known for, they always had a car, so they picked up other children, take them to church, and kids whose parents were not involved in the church. And it was just a very strong community of church-going people in our family, as well as educators. My mother also, at one time, operated a school, a preschool in our home, and she became a beautician, so she had many talents. As I said, my daddy was the greatest provider. You know, he just did everything he could to make sure his family was well cared for. And that's about most of it. And of course, I went on to high school and then graduated from high school, went on to college. And still, I graduated from high school in my hometown, but I ended up going to the Texas side to finish high school, which put me in like the tale of 2 cities, you know, man without a home. But as a result of that, I always had a problem with which school reunion would I go to, the Texas side or the Arkansas side. Sometimes I've gone to both. I went from high school to University of Arkansas at AM&N is what it's called. But at that time, it was just called AM&N College, Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College, which was a land grant college the state provided for the black African-American kids in that time. Great school, great teachers, great professors. My whole experience in education until I transferred to California was in predominantly African-American instruction. But occasionally we would have instructors in the college, in the African-American schools. I went to Howard University my freshman year, I forgot about that. And so we did have a mixture of professors at Howard and at the University of Arkansas at AM&N, but our student body was primarily, almost 99% African-Americans. So when I went to California my junior year, I ended up going to Cal State Hayward, graduating from that school, and then went on from there to San Jose State University, got my master's there. But I always wanted to be in the arts in some way or another. At this time, I still was practicing Christianity. And when I had my children, excuse me, when I had my children became older enough to look at them in retrospect and say, okay, which way do I want them to go? I knew I wanted them to be educated, but where did I want to have them be educated? And at some point in my life, I decided I want them to come to the South. So,
you know, that's so interesting that you wanted them to have the experience of being raised, of growing up in the South. And why would you say that was? Because you know, growing up in Texarkana, right?
mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you experience any aspect of Jim Crow?
Oh,
I mean,
my
yeah.
civil rights experiences were especially in Texarkana. When my brother and I came home from college one year, and I believe that was in 62 or 63, we were part of a movement. My brother was part of a movement that was called SNCC, Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and at the school that I eventually went to. I was basically, I took 1 year to work, that's right, and after my freshman year, so it was 63. And so I was there when working when President Kennedy was killed. So we organized a nonviolent process, which was called a wade-in, which was designed to allow us to integrate a public facility which was called the Texarkana Dam. We had no beaches, we had no swimming pools that were specifically for the African Americans until later in the recreation departments. So at that time, a lot of African American kids would go to creeks and ponds to swim. And as a result, some of them drowned, and of course they weren't safe. And this one particular area at the dam, which looked like a beach below the reservoir, below the dam, was a nice place to go and wade in the water. And so we organized under the instruction and direction of the NAACP to do this particular wade-in. And we were instructed not to bring any kind of weapons and to be peaceful and not forceful. And it was part of their process administratively to notify the security, the police, all of the different people who would be affected. But this particular location was outside of the city limits. Even though the city, this is what my thinking was, even though the city police force had been notified, the actual location was outside of that jurisdiction, which was more like, at that time, we would call a Jim Crow area, or really kind of farmland people. So when we got there, and I don't know how many cars that we had, but certainly we caravaned there, which was about maybe 15 or 20 miles outside of the city limits. When we got there, the goal was to climb up this hill and go down the other hill after parking our cars and wade in the water and just basically demonstrate, like July the 4th, we want to swim too. But first we want to get in the water without any problems. So my brother and I had traveled together, and there were some other people who were there who were known as protectors, men who were known in the community as being ready to prepared to do whatever it took to protect people. And so when we got down to the water, we started to walk into the water, and then after that, a group of Caucasian men came with big cases of empty soda bottles. And at that time, they were wooden cases. They put the bottles in them like that. They brought them by handle, and they put them down near the beach, the water, the edge of the water, and they walked along and broke these bottles. So when we came out of the water, we were subject to cut our feet. And of course, that caused a conflict, somewhat of a riot. And my brother and I were able to get to our car. And then after that, we started to hear gunshots. And of course, several people were injured and were taken to the hospital. The African Americans were. And most of them were arrested for inciting a riot. So that was the most horrifying experience I had with the civil rights movement. I had other experiences that were not nearly so horrible after a while, but.
Wow, so broken glass on the beach. That's amazing. Wow. How did your parents feel about your involvement with SNCC? Were they worried?
Yes. The funny thing was that my mother had told us not to take any weapons, but when we got to the car, my brother opened the trunk of the car and he had golf clubs in there. He was a caddy, and he also golfed at that time, even though he golfed in college even. But that was his weapons. But my mother scolded him for even taking anything because she felt that having any weapons would be a danger. She had no idea that that was going to happen, but she did really caution us. Don't fight, follow the rules of the nonviolent movement, which I have questions about. At that time, we were very well trained. But of course, like I said, there were these so-called bully boys that were there who didn't take that. They didn't go to the training. So I'm sure that they had something to do with what happened as a result.
This was 1963.
Yes, I would think it was 1963 because that was the year that I was home. I went to 62, 63, 63, 64 in that time frame. And since it was leading into the 4th of July, I think it was really the summer of 64.
Now, the young men that wanted to fight back, were they affiliated with any particular group, or these were just young men who didn't want to deal with this?
In our neighborhoods, and it's probably so in most small communities, there are always people who stand out as being either violent or protective, thieves, peeping toms. You had every kind of character. Women, wife beaters, all kinds of people. Well, these were a group of people who were brothers, and they called them the Bolio brothers because there were about 11 of them. And some of them were educated, some of them were abusive to their wives, some of them did different things. But collectively, they stayed together. They stuck together, and they were protectors in their own way of the community. So, but they weren't gangs or nothing like that. They were just some older men and some younger. They spanned the ages from like teenage all the way up to maybe 30. I vaguely remember them, but that's basically who I think they were, the ones who kind of like, okay, we're not taking this stuff.
Amongst the African American community in Texarkana, was there any representation of groups like Nation of Islam at that time?
Interesting. I don't recall that nomenclature, but I do recall hearing Elijah Muhammad and some other Nation of Islam speakers on the radio, or some other sources of information was available through my older brother, not the one who was with me. I had two brothers at that time, and I had a younger one later. But the one who was going to the college, not the one who finished the music, was not the, and let me back up, the one who ended up being in music, my oldest brother, and later he became a Christian minister. I saw him reading things that had to do with Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, and I heard him listen. I knew he listened to some things like that. Later on, when I became Muslim, many years later, he shared with me that he had read the Quran. But he had also read the Bible too, from front to back. He was an ardent reader. But as far as anyone in my area being part of that, I just don't recall.
And what religion were you raised in? What denomination of Christianity?
Christian Methodist Episcopalian, CME.
Now, in Texarkana, the African American community, how would you describe it overall in terms of the percentage of people who are working class versus professional?
Oh, we had business owners. Because of the segregation, we had our own schools, private schools, kindergartens and preschools at that time. At that time, kindergarten was taught privately, and then first grade was where you began. And we had the funeral home directors were black, the doctor's offices, there was a hospital, the Jameson Hospital was owned by an African American. So many of the services that we needed and required and received came through African American businesses, the insurance companies, beauty salons, barbershops. So even though we were a small city at that time, I remember as a child seeing the population sign when you would enter and exit the city being something like 25,000. But now I believe it's over maybe 100,000, maybe more. I think I saw it one time much later, like 60 or 70,000. So it's grown tremendously. But at that time, I would say, I can't really say what the demographics were, but our community was so African American centered. It looked like everybody was African American. There were a few Hispanics, a few Indians, Native American Indians in the community. In fact, my grandmother is Cherokee, and so, her mother was Cherokee. She's part Cherokee. So we had that kind of contact with the Hispanic community because they would come into our neighborhood selling hot tamales and things like that.
I was going to ask you food.
And they pushed them on these carts, or they had them on the back of their trucks, and somehow they were hot. And of course, that was the days when they also drove up and down the street with watermelons on the trucks. But it was a good time. But my mother, believe it or not, she was such a outgoing person, even though she worked as a maid occasionally and took me with her into the homes that she worked for, doctors and teachers and so forth. She also had a very good rapport with the white group of people, middle class and otherwise wealthy, whatever, because of her own personality and her own acceptance that she was just as good as anybody else. And so she never seemed to have that sense of, I'm black and they're white. She always seemed to have that ability to integrate herself into social activities. And sometimes, for me, it was a little bit overbearing, because when we would be downtown, and it was really literally a downtown where all the little shops were, she would definitely know people, the shopkeepers and shop owners, and they called her by her first name. She called them by Miss Klein, Miss whatever their names were, Miss Levine, Miss Klein. So later found out those were Jewish families. But they were really great with my mom, and so she would always let them know of our achievements, and I would say, oh, Mother, don't tell all of that. But she was always really happy and proud to share with them what her children were doing. So I didn't realize it, but she was setting a precedence for respect and just letting them know that we're great people too. And so she instilled that in us to feel that way. So I don't recall her having really any issues with racial tension. I don't recall her telling me of any, but I do know they grew up knowing, so to speak, their position, and so they own property, they own their own land, and they had their own food, so I guess they didn't really need to have that outside integrated experience.
So when Texarkana became, desegregated, how did the African American community feel about that?
When it what?
When it eventually became, desegregated, I'm sure there was a process of desegregation.
Oh, good question, because it did have an effect, a very serious effect on the young people who followed me, because the integration really took place after I left. And I left in '62, my freshman year, and then later I came back and then I stayed a year, and then I left from then on forever, pretty much, except coming home for summer visits and holidays. But I had a younger brother who was 8 years younger than I am, who went through the high school, segregated, that I went to, and then eventually they integrated the high school while he was in about the 11th grade. Well, he was a band member, and interesting enough, when you integrate your schools, you integrate your music, and now, which music do you play? Do you play Dixie, or do you play another song that has to do with the experience of the African American, whatever it may be? Well, when they integrated the schools, that was one of the things that was affected, what music they played, what they studied. I mean, it was such a tremendous and traumatic impact.
Were there any violent episodes?
My brother was impacted mentally, even though we won't say that was on the entire source of it, but he ended up having some mental issues and eventually we don't know how much he engaged in drugs, but it wasn't apparent that he was involved in drugs. But perhaps a drug initiated his disease, which is called paranoid schizophrenia. But we didn't notice it until after he had these issues in high school. And then, of course, after that, it became a matter of how do you treat it. And so some of the medication that they used to treat him eventually caused it to be worse. So he hasn't been able to live a really, quote unquote, normal life like we do since then. And he's now 60 years old. So not only was he affected, but several others have different experiences. Some of them did become violent. Some people wrote about it, you know, expressed it in their writings, and they ended up believing that it wasn't the best thing, in their opinion, in terms of forming and shaping identity and sense of who you are. But, you know, it was something that possibly had its advantages eventually over the years. But I think it, in some way, was a shortfall for the African-American kids.
You mentioned kind of that you had some questions about the effectiveness of the nonviolent approach to challenging the oppression that African-Americans face. So when you moved to California, did you have any interaction with groups, let's say, like the Panthers? And when you started to question nonviolence, how did that end up expressing itself for you?
Well, you seem like you know my history. I was very sympathetic to the Black Panther Party. I dressed like a Black Panther in college at Cal State Hayward. I wore my hair like the Black Panther. And one of the teachers here at Muhammad School later on told my students at Muhammad School one day, she said, you know, Sister Opal used to be a member of the Black Panthers. I wasn't an official member of the Black Panther Party, but I certainly did attend some of their events. I memorized some of their slogans, and I kind of observed and felt very good about some of the things that they were involved in, especially feeding. And I empathized with their 10-point plan, which was, you know, basically addressing how they should be treated, especially in prison systems and so forth and so on. So yeah, I really identified with that movement, that group, in terms of what they were trying to do, and I admired them for their courage. And had I not possibly been in a college institution, I probably would have been out there doing what they were doing. But I had that protection, I guess, in a sense, that for whatever reason. I was really studying Malcolm X in college, since I was at that time majoring in speech and theater. And so I had to do papers a lot of times. And so he was one of the central figures in my writing. Although there was the Black Panther Party over here, and there was the Nation of Islam over here, and then there was the Pan-African movement over here, I sort of looked at both of them, but I knew I did not want to be in that Nation of Islam. I was frightened of those people because I just felt like they will do anything, you know, and I didn't have a total good concept of what they were about, but their theology, which at that time wasn't really a theology about black man is God and that kind of thing, I just couldn't buy into that. But the political activist movement, you know, I could, but the religious part of it, I couldn't tie into. But what I did admire the most, which really caused me to do more with the life of Malcolm X, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, was the way he was able to speak to a diverse group of people in harmony with such a dynamic response from so many diverse groups at the same time in large stadiums. White people, black people, Mexican people, you know, every nationality could be there and listen to him and be applauding him. So one of my assignments in my graduate course later in my speech, one of my advanced speech assignments was to write a paper. Basically, the subject matter was rhetoric, the impact of rhetoric. That was basically the subject. And I just chose him as my thesis. And I remember the title of the paper, and I really wish I kept it, You know, at that time, we didn't copy everything. We just gave it to the professor, and that was the last of it. And they put it in their books later on, I guess. But the paper was called The Dual Dynamics of Rhetoric of Malcolm X, the rhetoric of Malcolm X. And, you know, and by saying the duality, I was just talking about that he could speak and to address two opposing kinds of groups, and at the same time have an effect using such powerful rhetoric. So that made me really get really involved with his methodology, how he approached people, how he thought. And that kind of tempered my feelings about the Nation of Islam. Of course, you know later on his history of his moving into the Orthodox so-called Islam. But as a revolutionary person, which I was really involved with through the theater, and we had at that time what we called revolutionary theater. And the revolutionary theater, I guess, maybe grew out of Pan-Africanism, or maybe partially out of the Black Panther, a combination of all of those movements. But it was really a movement that's, I think, part of the catalyst for it in terms of the violent aspect of it might have been inspired by the Black Panther Party. But the revolutionary writers, such as Amir Baraka, who at that time was known as Leroy Jones, and there was others, and there was even some who touched upon revolutionary theater, such as Lonnie Elder, but his wasn't quite as violent, but it was still protest theater, and so that was my way of exercising my voice, was through theater. And so during the 60s, no, during the 70s, the latter part of the 60s and the 70s, during that so-called revolutionary period, I directed plays, and they were aimed at that time, offing the pigs, or having revolution with or without bloodshed, you know, those kind of concepts. But one of the plays that I directed was a play called El Hajj Malik. It wasn't revolutionary necessarily, but it was about Malcolm X and how he went through the transition, how he eventually, you know, had to try to protect himself and eventually his demise. So I did it as a musical. And if you've ever seen the movie Malcolm, you saw the way he danced as a young man. It was with the zoot suits and all that kind of thing. I did my play, even though later the movie came out, my play was kind of based on that same design. I didn't write the play. I can't remember who wrote the play, but I had access to it, and I directed it as a musical, and it was a wonderful play. I performed at different schools. Then, after the college-educated part, I mean, getting through the schooling and then getting my degree in theater and so forth, I got my master's in theater. I started teaching while I was in college. I started teaching acting classes and history of the theater in America, history of black theater in America. And I was, during that time, colleges were curious and they wanted to have that as part of their curriculum. So I went from school to school, San Jose State, Cal State Hayward, Laney College, and taught black theater. Until all the blacks that had theater, then we no longer needed it anymore. But that was what I started doing in the beginning in my teaching career in college, was teaching black theater in America. So
that's awesome. And you know, I just love the way you've set up the scene, you know, California, and you've talked about the different movements, Panthers, Pan-African, the Pan-Africanists, the Nation of Islam. You know, your admiration for Malcolm X, and I had no idea that you directed theater. You had a master's in theater. That's amazing, and you know, this pioneering role, sort of introducing the idea of black theater to different universities. But let me ask you this: did you ever did Malcolm X know about your play? Did you, or would?
It was after he had passed away.
Okay, after he passed. Did you have a chance to ever interact with him?
No, I've actually had a chance to hear him speak, but I never. He spoke at in California on several occasions, but at one particular event, I did have a chance to hear him speak. But I listened to his recordings. I had recorded speeches by him that helped me in my writing about him. And I wanted to mention something else about what you just said, the pioneering aspect. I think it was further along the way, it was, that I decided that I wanted to do something more in theater and in the arts. And it was after this colleges started to eliminate classes in black theater and just have just basic acting classes. And that's when my jobs began to diminish, because now we don't need a black person to teach acting. We can get Lucille Ball's theater coach to teach acting at these colleges and universities. So then I went back to school and decided to get a teaching certification for secondary education in English and speech and drama. So I left the college circuits more or less and went into teaching high school. But somewhere along the way, in between those two fields, and of course I started having children too, I went to interview with the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater to become, I said, okay, I'll go into arts administration since we're not doing a lot of black theater anymore. And so I've managed to get an interview at the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater in New York. So I flew from California to New York. And a friend of mine knew James Baldwin. And she says, oh, well, I have a place where you can stay. I'll try to get in touch with James Baldwin. He has a brother who has an apartment right there in Harlem where you're going to be going. And sure enough, she did make arrangements, and I was able to visit them, and they provided me with a place to stay. James Baldwin wasn't there. His brother was my kind person who allowed me to stay there. But I did get to meet James Baldwin, and I told him about my discontent with the way the theater was moving. You know, the black theater concept was dying and blah, blah, blah. And so I remember him admonishing me, telling me, you are a pioneer, and that's what made that word come up. When you mentioned pioneering, and that's what he told me. He said, you're a pioneer. Don't stop doing black theater. And I kind of held on to that for a while, but I had to start writing my own plays and getting other plays that were not as powerful. And it got kind of, you know, a lot of fatigue set in with that. But I tried to uphold what he said, and so, but I will keep that advice in my heart, and I think I'm driven by it to get back into the theater with, once I mentioned the Jewel Institute and some other things, to get back into it in the sense that I can promote history and other aspects of the African American experience, and sort of relive and revive what we used to do in terms of the dynamics that we put forth. I mean, there's a lot of movies, there's a lot of stuff going on in African American movie, film industry, and in the theater in general. But I feel like I have a different voice, and so I want to share that.
And there's a great need in the Muslim community, and it's a rare Muslim school that will have a drama program. You know?
Yeah, well, you know, they do have theater here at Muhammad School occasionally, but it's not a really part of the total curriculum. I did do plays here. I introduced my students here at Muhammad School when I was teaching here to the Black Panther movement, because they hadn't had that experience. And one of the plays I directed here was involving the Black Panther movement, giving them the 10-point plan and letting them read it off. I met Kathleen Cleaver as well. That's an interesting story. Can I share that with you? Okay, let me go back to California when I became Muslim. You didn't ask me about that, but if you can.
That was my next question.
Okay.
Yeah, when, you know, mom, when you became Muslim?
Okay. I'm trying to really remember. Okay, I was teaching black theater, and then I began to teach acting at a college called Foothill College. And I had a student there who was a young adult, with a child and a husband, because it was a junior college, 2-year college. She was coming, and she was like maybe 19 or 20 years old. And she was a very good actress. You know, she showed very good interest in acting. So I kind of pulled her to the side and worked with her outside of the classroom in her acting skills. And so part of that involved me assisting her and her family because they were on welfare or something like that. And occasionally I would give them my leftovers and whatever I had. But we kept a rapport over the years until back in 70, in 1970, my little girl was born. Okay. So in 70, I had my first child. My husband and I got married. And see, I had finished college teaching. I finished my master's. No, he attended my graduation for my master's, about 68, 69, somewhere around there. But after getting married, of course, and my husband, and we lived in San Jose, California. I had lived in Hayward for a moment because I was going to school in Hayward, but then I went to San Jose State and moved to San Jose State. And my husband and I got married. Then we had a little girl in 1970. And so now I'm a housewife and a part-time teacher here and there. Well, I was teaching at Foothill College, and so after so many years of teaching there, I eventually decided that I was going to do some plays. And so I started doing community theater, which was not revolutionarily based. It was Christian-based or fight the drugs based, you know, whatever. And also at the college, I did Raising the Sun. You know, I did traditional African-American theater. So I directed over 40 main stage productions throughout that time frame, from like the 70s to the 80s when I left. And this young lady, whose name is Charmaine, came to me one day and said, you know, I have this book that I've been reading about Sojourner Truth. And so she says, I'd like to do a play about her. Well, I had just met some Muslims just before this happened. And the Muslims had invited me to an event. I'm getting the scenario, getting the time frames, but yeah. How did we do this? Yeah. I had directed this play with her, and it was called Ain't I a Woman? Other people did it later, but as far as I know, we were the first one to do it in a full-blown script. She brought it to my attention, and I wrote the script through days and days of seclusion based on this book, The Life and Narratives of Sojourner Truth, and I wrote it as a one-woman play. And she and I collaborated together, but basically it was my writing it so it could come up dramatically as a one-woman show. And there were certain dimensions that you have to pay attention to when you're using one person to portray all this interaction with other people in the theater. So we eventually got a script out of it, started directing it with her. We would get together. My daughter, who was a little girl, would hear us practicing. And she's 43 years old now, and she can still recite the lines because she heard the rehearsal so much. So then we started off with a small production here, and eventually, in which I was financing, you know, by renting a little place. And then eventually it got to the point where it became relatively popular. Well, in '74, I think it was 1974, 74, 78, I don't know, remember the year. 74 is when we first did it, and around 78 is when someone contacted me from the American Muslim Mission at that time, I think it was called, but it was this community of Muslims. They contacted me in San Jose and asked me, they heard about the play and they wanted to know if I would bring it to this particular location where they were having a fundraiser at Half Moon Bay in California, near San Francisco, between Foothill College, where I was working, and San Francisco. So we agreed to do it. So, of course, I wasn't Muslim, so off the record, I was smoking at the time, cigarettes. And so she also smoked cigarettes, but we went to this event, and it was just so beautiful. And they had all of this food, and they had jazz, they had music. And I never thought Muslims would have music and be entertaining like that. And so I just looked at them in admiration. And then the fact that they respected my work, and I just thought it was awesome. And the women were so beautifully adorned, and they had this food, and it was just gorgeous. So then they showed a film. During the intermission at some point, they showed this film. And this film showed Muslims praying and Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, and all of that stuff was integrated into this film. I don't know what the film was called, but I was just like, oh my God, oh my God. So anyway, they showed this film, and I saw this prayer. So they were showing this movie, a film about Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and the process of becoming into the community of Muslims. And it just seemed so overwhelming to me, just so beautiful. And when I saw them standing in line for prayer, I was just mesmerized. So the person who had initially met me when we got there, and when we arrived, Charmaine and I, he wanted us to pay admission. And I said, we're on the program. I don't pay admission when I'm on the program. And he said, well, we do it different here. I later found out that was true. And you can be on the program, you still have to pay. But in some cases, so I basically talked him out of it. And so we didn't pay. We got a chance to go in and perform. Otherwise, we wouldn't have performed. So after our production, I went outside, and that's when I was telling you off the record, I smoked a cigarette, and he said, you don't need that. And that's when I thought, he's right, I don't need this. So later he became my husband, the very person that I'd argue with at the door. But I asked him, how do you get to do this? How, basically, innocently, how do you become like this, like you guys are? So I didn't come into Islam out of the realm of, I studied it first. Some people say they really looked into it, they went to classes. I didn't do it. I was impressed by the spirit, the nature of the people, the cleanliness, no alcohol, no smoking, all of that was just, to me, paradise. So we finally met later and talked about me hosting an interfaith event in my home. And I was, like I said, I had a beautiful home in California, and so my ex-husband and I were separated. And so I hosted, I think we had gotten a divorce by then, but I hosted this event, and so the imam and the man his assistant, who later became my husband, and several of the other women in the community, which was a very small community in Mountain View, California, right near Stanford, very small African-American community, but they would go to Oakland every fourth Sunday for the so-called fourth Sunday hookup, which is a very interesting part of the history of our evolution in Islam. Because on the fourth Sunday, the Oakland Masjid had a huge facility. And they had this video, a movie, or a loudspeaker where you could hear Imam Wahdi Muhammad speak for 3 and 4 hours at a time, just speaking. So that was my indoctrination, really. But I invited them. I mean, I did offer to allow them to come, and they did. And so the idea was to invite Christians and Muslims to my home to hear them engage with us about our religions. So 2 of the sisters that I invited who were Christian came, and somebody that they invited came. And of course, they were there. And they were just so knowledgeable about the Bible as well as the Quran, and they were just knowledgeable about the whole aspect of God and this oneness of Allah and the concept of unity. It's just really just answered my questions about the things that I had experienced as a child, about how do I pray, and I have to have this image in front of me, and it was very difficult for me to embrace that process. Well, this was like, oh, this is the way you do it. I don't have to have this intermediary. I can just pray to God. And so that was it for me. One of the sisters who was there was my friend, Hannah. She also accepted Islam through Interfaith, and she's endearing. We both met each other again on Hajj years later after I moved here, and she was still in California. So we keep a close tie. We keep in touch with each other. But that was my experience in Islam through Interfaith, and as a result, I've considered that my mission. And it's just something that it's innately I'm drawn to. And my favorite quote from the Quran is, Allah created us in nations and tribes so that we may come to know each other and not to despise each other. And that to me is education. You know, that's the catalyst for educating. So you want to know something before you despise it. So I try to know people, whether they're Muslims, Jews, Christians, or whatever, before I take that view of disliking them. Because it not only applies to religious thought, it applies to just people in general, in my opinion. So I tend to sometimes be more open than maybe my children will be, or somebody else, or my friends, because I think you have to give people that opportunity. So I guess I got off the subject somewhat, but that's really kind of a process for getting into Islam. But that particular play that we did, eventually it became, as we had planned, a very long-running play, and it's still performed today.
Ain't I a Woman?
Mm-hmm. She's doing it on YouTube now, and I saw her years later. And actually, she came to my house, which is a very pivotal point in my life. And I don't know if she'll ever see this interview, which I don't mind if she does. But I had finally gotten the script finished, and we had once gone to a lawyer about collaboration, and we didn't agree while we were at the attorney's office, but I still kept on pursuing that we would agree how we would divide the royalties and the work and so forth. And we used pen names, my middle name and her maiden name, on the script, and it was ready to be copyrighted. And one day she came to my home, and actually it's the day that the Muslim community was there at my home. So it was like, here's the theater, and here's the Muslims, and here's this issue. And I was just so leaning towards Islam that I was ready to let go of anything that was a problem, and that was becoming a problem. So I did, she said, I want to get the script so I can get it copyrighted, which we had agreed would be copyrighted in both of our names. So I got the script for her, and when she looked at the script, I said, now, instead of using my name, Jewel, on the script, I think I want to use my name. And she said, this is mine. And basically, that was the end, the beginning of the end of our relationship. And she performs it just as I envisioned, as a work that could always be and will be as long as she kept it, and she does. So I took my daughter to see her when she performed a few years ago. Now, mind you, my daughters are grown up with kids now. She performed it at Agnes Scott. And we got a chance to meet and greet, and it was kind of cute to watch my daughter sitting next to me in the audience reciting the lines. While she's on stage, my daughter's sitting there reciting the lines of the script. So that was that process closed, but I kept on doing theater in other ways through other sources. But for the moment, I stopped doing everything artistically when I became a student of Islam for almost 2 years. I wouldn't do anything. And then, of course, like I said, I went back to teaching English and so forth. So I eventually came to Georgia and started teaching at Muhammad School, and I got a little bit involved in theater again. And so, of course, I did things in the classroom. I taught public school here, too. I did a little bit at Tucker High School. And then I came to Muhammad School, Darden Noor School, and then I went to the airport. So.
Now, you mentioned that you decided that you, at some point, that you wanted to raise your children in the South. When was that?
Yes, yes. I had the older sister that was the only person, aside from Elizabeth Taylor, that I thought was the most beautiful person in the world. Later on, Annette Funicello. I liked the dark hair. But my oldest sister was gifted, and she was the one who first played the piano that was brought home and eventually became very good. And she went to Tuskegee Institute and was in the choir and with a very well-known musician named William L. Dawson. And she traveled, and at the time Ed Sullivan show was on, and they went there. You know, so she was part of a world that oh my gosh, my sister is awesome. And she eventually ended up at Spelman, actually getting her master's after finishing at Tuskegee Institute, getting her master's at Atlanta University. And so I'm a little girl at home, and I'm just imagining this sister who's doing all these wonderful things. And the word Atlanta just like blew my mind. Atlanta, two places, Atlanta and Morocco. Those two places just stuck with me like a child in Fantasyland. One day I'm going to go to Atlanta, and one day I'm going to go to Morocco. They just sound beautiful. So she was in Atlanta, and when she would come home to visit, I would just think, one day I'm going to go to Atlanta, because has to be the reason my sister is so wonderful. Well, I didn't go right away. I went to live with her after I moved to California, and eventually, I went to visit her sometimes as a teenager, but eventually I went to live with her because in order to go to college in California, I had to do 1 year of residency in order to establish so I stayed with her and went to junior colleges until I got my 1 year. And then I went to Cal State Hayward. So I had interruption in my 4-year process. So after I went to California colleges, I eventually ended up teaching in California schools. And there was something always missing that I had gotten in the South, including at Howard as an African-American school too, that I felt that the California schools just didn't provide. And one was that strong sense of identity, that strong sense of history, tradition, culture. I saw some of the cultural aspects in Oakland, but I didn't see it in a broad sense of the word, especially in San Jose, where I was living, in what we call a bedroom city, because it was just homes and IBM, and you live and you work to own a beautiful home and a beautiful car. And that was what we were basically, to me, saying to the students. Even though Stanford was down the street, the Silicon Valley was in between where I live and Stanford. So the idea was wherever way you could do it, get a good job, and you can live here. So you can go to Stanford, you can go to Cal State, you can go to Hayward, whatever, or you can just go to Silicon Valley and just be a worker. But I didn't feel that my children were going to get that sense of identity in California. They may get that inspiration to work, to go out and go to school and get a job, but I just felt like they needed to have that sense of identity, that core that I had. And so when my daughter was in high school, my oldest daughter was in high school, I had remarried, I decided to sell my home and bring my California money to Georgia. And my husband and I agreed to that. And she was 15 when we moved to Georgia. We got a little house 1 year later, and she was in the backyard, and we had blueberries growing in the backyard. And I remember her looking back at me. I was looking out the window and looking at them picking blueberries. I had 2 other children by my second husband. And she was looking and picking the blueberries, and she yelled up, "Mama!" I said, "What? Is this why we moved to Georgia?" So I think that didn't quite answer the question for her, but I really wanted them to have that experience. And so as a result, they both chose to go to African-American colleges their first year or two. Both of them went to 2 years at an African-American college. She went to Hampton, and my younger daughter went to Morris Brown. And eventually they graduated in non-traditional African-American schools, but they did have the experience. Now they have children, so.
How did you find the Atlanta Muslim community when you moved to Atlanta? What part of town were you in? I'm just a little bit curious about what the community was like back then.
Oh, actually, I came partly because of inspiration by my daughter to come to Atlanta, by my sister. But since I become Muslim, I had a different reason to come, as well as how I would, where I would go and where I would live, where I would worship. And so I chose Atlanta Masjid here because I had heard Imam Pasha speak at an event in Sedalia, I believe, just Sedalia, North Carolina. And by the time I got here, he was no longer the head imam, but he was still part of the Imam Pleman had become the head man by the time I moved here. But I was like, oh, I got to get to Atlanta too soon, because this Imam Pasha, I want to hear him speak, because I had been exposed to Imam Wardi Muhammad and then eventually Imam Fahim Shuaib, and even before that, and didn't know it at the time, but the man who was the teacher when I first started going to Masjid in Oakland was Minister Farad Muhammad. But I didn't know it until like one day, years later, I showed a picture of us standing in front of the masjid, a big group picture, and Imam Fahim said, oh, that's Minister Farad Muhammad. I said, really? All this time he was teaching his brother Mustafa or something like that. Muhammad Mustafa or something like that. Not Mustafa. Abdullah. That was his name. So
the actual Minister
Farad Muhammad.
Now, there were some theories about where he was from and what he ended up doing. So.
He was the teacher in Oakland Masjid. He was the imam under the name of Muhammad Abdullah.
That's fascinating. What was his ethnicity?
What?
His ethnicity. What was his ethnicity?
He was Indo-Pakistani or Arab. You could tell he wasn't an African American. I mean, he stood out and at that time he was gray hair.
And was this late 70s, early 80s?
I converted in 78, so 78, 79, 79.
That's intriguing. Wow. Thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah, and I still think I can find the picture. I believe I've packed and moved since then several times, but. And I wouldn't have known. Nobody ever said anything about it. But then Imam Fahim Shuaib confirmed it. Oh, that's Minister Imam Muhammad. That's Minister Farad Muhammad. I said, what? All this time? I didn't know. So if it's true, that's a great piece of history there. So when I got here, I was already impressed by several other teachers. And Imam Wardi Muhammad at one time was also our imam in Oakland during the transitional from Imam Muhammad Abdullah and another imam that eventually I think they had to remove him for some behavior problems. Then Imam Wardi Muhammad came and stayed for a little period. And then I think he passed it on to Imam Fahim Shuaib. And I was still there when that happened. Then eventually I came here, which was in '85. So from 78 to 85, I was in that community. And the community that I had started in, a little small community that we did the interfaith gathering at, had disbanded because of some leadership issues with this head imam. Eventually, they kind of disbanded, fizzled out. And most of those people stayed in the Oakland community and just commuted from different little cities surrounding Oakland. Of course, when I came here, my first test in terms of the cultural shock for me in the community was, in my opinion, not very warm. I always felt the California people laid back, open, warm people. And I just felt that I had to prove myself, in a sense, to be worthy of the kind of hospitality that I felt that should have been offered. Because I came here as a single mom, not single in terms of marriage, but my husband was still in California trying to get processed the house and stuff that had to be done to move here. And there's a long story behind that, which I won't go into, a personal story. But basically, my daughters, my son, and myself had to set up housekeeping here. So we were coming to the masjid from a distance quite a ways away. And you mentioned where was I living? I was living in Atlanta near Fairburn Road. And so for that first year, I was commuting. And I didn't like Atlanta freeways. And I would tell my husband, you've got to hurry up and come because I can't drive on these freeways. So it was such a hardship for me having 3 kids and driving here. And then when I get here, there was no, in my opinion, no warmth. And I brought it to the attention of the imam that I felt that there was no hospitality afforded people who were newcomers to the communities. And the response was, well, you know, a lot of people come and they go and they don't stay. And I felt that was not the appropriate way to respond to somebody who's asking for But eventually I was given the name of one of the women in the community to reach out to, and I did. And she sort of helped me get through that process. And then eventually I got involved with some of the programs that were involved, you know, with fundraising, youth thrusts at that time. And then eventually I befriended a sister who has been my friend ever since, Sister Mira Wazir. She and I have both been transplants, and we were sort of experiencing some similar things. So we got to talking about things that we shared and that were similar, and the way we came into Islam. She came through studying first, and I came through socialization first. So after a while, little by little, the community began to address that, because I think it became more recognized, and more people started to point it out. So now, you know, they have a different procedure. They have hospitality, greeters, and there's just a lot more warmth. At that time, it wasn't. So that was very difficult. And part of it may have caused parts of my family to kind of say, nah, you know, I won't mention which ones, but not my two younger ones, because they didn't have a choice. They were born Muslim with name Muhammad and so forth and so on. They were put in the schools, and so they only knew Islam. But my oldest daughter and my ex-husband were kind of felt disenfranchised. And so that's kind of what happened.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we are approaching the, yeah, we definitely hit the 1 hour mark, a little bit above that. But you have touched on a number of topics and shared some wonderful insights, personal, social, community, historical. So is there anything I didn't get to that you'd like to conclude our conversation with?
Well, although I try to, I guess the biggest thing that is important to me at this point in my life, and having multiple marriages and multiple experiences throughout my life, is that now that I'm really stay on my mission, and that mission, which I feel it's not only in the productions of theater, but also using that as a tool to further my mission as an interfaith person of interfaith, as well as a person who's very strongly committed to African American culture and history as well. But the culture part is really my focus, and I'm just really happy about this particular project that you're doing, because it gives me more of motivation to see how now we can kind of embrace that whole concept of African American culture, and yet let it serve to inspire others who are not African Americans to at least have a view, a positive view of African Americans, as well as African American Muslims, as well as Islam in general. So whenever I go about in places such as events like I did last night, somehow the fact that I'm Muslim doesn't seem to really affect the non-Muslims that I engage with. And I think that the spirit of interfaith has a way of really empowering us to be able to embrace everybody as universal, and knowing that Allah is one. He's the creator of all. And so we all somewhat connected. So I just hope that that can kind of be my goal and continue to be my goal and my pursuit, and that I can please Allah in doing so.
Sister Opal, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
This was an awesome interview.
Thank you.
And with that,